Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first episode of Blobinator Makes Games. This is my first time attempting to do a stream for game development. My name is Blobinator Q. Here I am. Hi. I wanted to start this stream so that I could get a chance to do some game development live. It's a great excuse for me to get working on some of the personal projects that I'd like to do. Hopefully it'll also be informative for some people out there who might be not so familiar with game development or not as familiar with Unity, because I'm going to be doing most of my development in Unity for now. I might dip into some Unreal maybe a few weeks or months down the road. This is the very first episode, so it's probably going to be a little bit bumpy. I'm still figuring out things like audio inputs and my XSplits setup and stuff like that, but hopefully we'll get through this. I'm going to stick to just some really basic stuff today, some basics of using Unity. So if you're familiar with game development, then this episode might be a little on the dull side, but hopefully this will help out anybody who is brand new to game development or not familiar with Unity, and it'll also give me a chance to work out some of the kinks in terms of the format of the show that I'm going to do, and some of the problems that I might run into with audio or video or streaming on Twitch and so on. Right now I am streaming on Twitch. I haven't quite decided if that's going to be a permanent thing or if I'm going to just make this a YouTube only show. If I do keep streaming it on Twitch, it's probably not going to be on Saturdays. I just wanted to do the first episode today to give me a little bit of time to figure out some of the hitches that I might run into. Now, one thing I wanted to say as a disclaimer before I get started on anything is just because I do something a certain way when I'm developing on this stream doesn't necessarily mean it's the best way to do it. I'm not going to say this disclaimer every episode. I just wanted to put it up here in the first episode. There are lots of cases in game development, as with programming in general, where there are lots of ways to address any given problem or to approach any given problem. And sometimes some ways are faster than others, but not necessarily better than others. There might be other instances where I may only know about one way to do it, but there might be lots of better ways to do it. So if anybody, if you see me do something on here, don't necessarily assume that that's an endorsement from me, that that's the best way to do it. If you have any suggestions for how I might have done something a little bit better, then by all means, please leave a comment or send me a message on Twitter or something, a DM. I should probably get my Twitter handle up and on some future episode, but for now I'll leave it here. You can see it on the bottom of my Twitch page, I think. So, yes, today I'm going to be doing, starting out a little bit of game development in Unity. And my general hope for this show is that instead of being a set of disconnected tutorials, I want to actually bring things together into a cohesive whole. So I will probably be doing some episodes that are tutorials on specific things in game development, but a big part of what I want to make sure I do is always bring those things then into an actual game. So there are lots of folks out there who do really great Unity tutorials, sort of one-offs. Quill18 is one of my personal favorites on YouTube at Quill18 Creates. He's great to go check out if you want to learn some really cool things in Unity. I'm probably not going to be following that format. I'm going to start out the show with one game that I'm going to be working on, and that will be the game I'll be working on for at least the next several episodes. Over time, I might introduce one or two other games sort of in different genres so that I can have multiple sort of platforms from which to show off different aspects of game development. But for now, I'm just going to stick with the one. So the first thing we should talk about is what game am I going to be developing? So let's switch over to this view. So I don't know if anybody out there has heard of Scorched Earth or maybe played it back in the 90s. For those who don't know, Scorched Earth was a game back in the 90s. It was a shareware game that was a turn-based artillery game. So if you haven't played Scorched Earth, you may have played games like Worms and Worms Armageddon. They were from the same mold. Worms obviously came later, added a little bit more humor and so on. But you can see the screenshot that I'm looking at here. In Scorched Earth, you played as a little tank. You can see in these little circles, you can see a little sort of vaguely tank-shaped shape. It was completely 2D, and you fired weapons at other tanks, trying to be the last tank standing. You could get money, and you could use that money to buy different weapons, more powerful weapons, and so on. Little things like the Funky Bomb, which would explode into a burst of other bombs, and so on. It was really the predecessor to games like Worms, not the only predecessor. There were other turn-based artillery games around. Scorched Earth was one of the best known. It was the first one that I played of that genre. So I'm going to start out developing a 3D version of Scorched Earth. And some of the reasons that I want to do this are, number one, it's a fairly simple concept, but it's something that can be extended a lot. And that's something that I think is very important when you're starting, especially a solo game project, you want to pick something that is not going to be biting off too much at once. So the core concept behind Scorched Earth is something that's really nice and simple. I'm not looking to actually release this game or make any money. This is just a learning project and something for me to put out there into the world. So I'm not looking for something that's a really creative or unique interpretation. Basically, I'm going to be making a Scorched Earth clone. I might get into some creative stuff here and there, but it's basically just a test bed from which we can explore some interesting things about game development. So, I'm going to be developing in Unity, so let's bring up Unity. So for anybody who's not familiar, this is Unity, the game development software. I'm using the free version of Unity, so I have the light theme going here. The pro version, you can switch to a dark theme, but other than the dark theme and some analytics tools, now with Unity 5, all the same features from Unity, the pro version of Unity, are also present in the free version of Unity, so you can do a lot with it. So in here, you can see we have the hierarchy view over here, which are the things that are in our current scene. You have a project view down here, and you have another tab where you can switch to the console window. Now personally, I like to actually detach my console window and put it aside because you don't need a very wide project view. So I like to be able to see my console window at all times. You have an inspector over here, which lets you inspect things in your scene. So if I click on my main camera over here, then that should, maybe it's not going to update the inspector. Oh, there we go. Just a little slow. So it updates the inspector over here, and I can see things about my camera. In here we have our scene view, so this is where we can actually take a look around at things that are in our scene. And we have the game view, so this is the view that we're seeing through our main camera. So when you load up Unity, you have this basic scene to start with that just has a main camera and a directional light. Now before I actually dive right in, I wanted to show a couple of things in my settings here. So if I go to my preferences and I go to external tools, you can see that I'm using Visual Studio 2015. That's what I'm going to be using for all my development. I'm just more familiar with Visual Studio, and I like it a lot. You can also use MonoDevelop, which is the sort of built-in editor that comes with Unity. It's not bad. It can do basically everything that Visual Studio can do, but I just prefer Visual Studio. Another thing that I have set up, I'll go into the project settings down here into Editor. And in here you can see that I have visible metafiles set right here. And under asset serialization I have force text. Now the reason I'm doing that is because I'm actually going to be uploading these projects. I have a GitHub or a Git repository locally, and I have a GitHub account where I'm going to be uploading these projects. And so you'll be able to go to that GitHub account. I'll get that up on my Twitch page at some point as well. And then you'll be able to download the files as I've worked on them in these episodes. Setting the version control mode to visible metafiles and the asset serialization to force text basically just makes everything play a little bit nicer with source control. So I wanted to give that as a little tip to anybody who's new to Unity. If you like to use source control like I do, then there's you'll save yourself some grief if you set things up that way. So right now we have our scene right here. Now if I hit play in this scene, we have a main camera and a directional light. If I hit play, there's what we see, which is not much. And that makes sense because we haven't really put anything into our scene yet. So I'm going to press the play button again, which stops the scene. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm actually going to save this scene, just so that then from then on I can just tap Control S and I will be able to save the scene. I'm going to call this Tank Game. Now, as you can see up in the corner here, I've actually called the project Launchy Lobster. That's me just taking a page out of Ubuntu's book. All of Ubuntu's Linux releases are named with an adjective and the name of an animal that starts with the same letter. Since this is a game about launching missiles and other things at enemy tanks, I figured launchy would be a good adjective, and then lobster starts with L. So that's the project that we're going to be working on here, is Launchy Lobster. So I've just saved out my scene as Tank Game, so it shows up down here in the project. Now, I like to organize things, so if you right-click down here and you say Create, you can actually create a folder. So I'm going to create a folder, and I'm going to call it Scenes. Now, there may come times when I'm going to work in little sort of experimental scenes in here, and in those instances I'll probably create a whole separate folder and put everything, including the scenes, into there. But this is going to be the scenes folder for my main project. So I'm actually going to drag that scene into there, and so now we can see we have a tank game. Now, the first thing we need with a tank game is a tank. Now, throughout this series I'm going to be avoiding getting things from the Unity Asset Store as much as I can. Now, the reason for that is that this is meant to be sort of a learning opportunity for me and for anybody watching. So getting things from the Asset Store would sort of defeat the point. The Unity Asset Store has some great stuff there if you're not really familiar with programming, or if there are just concepts that you're not all that familiar with and you don't necessarily want to learn them to try to get a game out the door. Then going on the Unity Asset Store is a great way to find bits and pieces that you might like. Also, if you're not an artist, as I am not, then you can go on the Unity Asset Store and find lots of great 3D models, 2D sprites, rigged animation models, and so on. I will probably at some point be going to the Asset Store or looking online for Creative Commons licensed artwork, because I don't want to subject anybody out there on the internet to my terrible, terrible artwork. But as it exists right now, or as things stand right now, I'm going to stay away from bringing in anything. So for this first episode, we're actually just going to create our tank out of pieces that Unity gives us. So let's go up here to Game Object, and we're going to create a 3D object, and we're going to create a cube. So there's our cube. You can take a look at it. It's at 0, 0, 0 in the world. The size of the cube, I think by default, is 2 units by 2 units by 2 units. I could be wrong on that, but I think that's the size of the cube. So this is essentially 2 units high, 2 units wide, and 2 units deep. So we could just say that's our tank and just go with that, but I think we can make it look a little bit more like a tank. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to scale down this cube a little bit. So let's make this cube 0.5 high. Now you can sort of see where the mesh is. There's sort of a ground mesh that's here because we don't really have a plane for things to sit on at the moment. But the mesh of 0, 0, 0 is going right through the middle of our tank, and we don't want that. So we actually want our tank to sit a little bit off the ground. But actually what we're going to do is we don't necessarily want to always be thinking of our tank as being somewhere higher. We could make this 0.5. Whoops, that's too much. 0.25. Maybe that's... Oh yeah, 0.25. Okay, so I guess our tank is our cube is 1 by 1 by 1 to start with. Now that we've scaled it down by 0.5 on the y-axis, it's now 0.5 tall. That's okay, so it's half a meter tall, which is a pretty small tank in reality, but we're going to go with it. So because we scaled it down to 0.5, we can raise it up by 0.25, and now it's sitting nicely on the ground. But we don't want to have to think about our tank always being 0.25 above the surface that it's sitting on. So what we're going to do is we're going to create an empty game object. So an empty game object is just as it sounds. It has nothing. It's just an empty an object that has a transform, which is a position, rotation, and scale. Nothing else in it. But we can place other things inside of it. So in our case, we're going to take this cube, we're going to rename this cube tank body, and we're going to put that underneath tank. So now the tank body is 0.25 above the ground, but the tank is at 0, 0, 0. And that's really nice. That lets us sort of abstract away the fact that the tank body is actually slightly above where we're thinking of our tank actually being. So now the actual position of our tank is right at the center bottom of our tank. So now let's see if we can make this look a little bit more like a tank. So right in here, we're going to right-click, say 3D object, and we're going to add a sphere. So that adds a sphere underneath our tank as well. And we're going to call this the tank dome. And let's move this upward a little bit. So basically what we're doing is we have a sphere that we are actually setting its local position relative to the tank that it's a part of. And I'm going to set it to 0.5. So that will move it upwards. Now, that's a little bit bigger than I would like. So I'm actually going to scale everything down to 0.5, 0.5, and 0.5. Oh, that's actually a little smaller. So actually, one way to make it, to get it to the size that we might want it is there's a little tool up here, which is the scaling tool. So when we grab that scaling tool, now we can grab individual axes and we can actually scale it on those axes. So we can sort of get it to roughly where we want it to be, and then from there we can sort of figure out what scale we might like. So it's looking to me like about 0.75 would be correct. So let's actually codify that. We'll actually set that directly on the object. That's just to give us some nice values that we know we have to work with from then on. So, starting to look a little bit more like a tank, but it's still missing one very important piece. So, what we're going to do is we're actually going to add a gun. So we're going to go 3D object. I'm going to add a cylinder. Now that's a gun right there. Okay, so the first thing we know we're going to have to do is we're going to have to scale that down considerably. So let's scale that down to 0.2 on the Z and 0.2 on the X. There we go, and that looks a little bit more reasonable. That's maybe even still a little big, so let's make it 0.1 and 0.1. There we go. Okay, now I've sort of purposely made a little bit of a mistake here because I think it's sort of interesting to talk about. So if we take this gun now and we grab our movement object, our movement tool, and we move it up here, and then we move it over here, and then we move it up here. Now, that's a really long gun too. Let's scale that down a bit. 0.5. Yeah, that looks good. Okay, so now we have a gun, and it is scaled to the size that we want. Now we want to rotate it. We want to rotate that about. Sorry, not about its y-axis. That's not where we want to rotate it. We want to rotate it about. You can take a look at the axes here, and you can see that the z-axis is actually pointing out this way, and that's the one we want to rotate. So let's rotate that 90 degrees about the z-axis. So now it's pointing directly forward, and now we can sort of position it right here. So now we have our little gun pointing out of the tank. Now the problem is, at some point we're going to want to turn our tank's gun. And if we want to turn the tank's gun right now, when we rotate, the gun is going to be rotating from the middle, because that's the pivot point of the gun itself. And we don't want that. We actually want the gun to be rotating about this part back here, which is embedded into the dome. So what we can do, the much better way to handle this, is we can actually parent the tank gun under the tank dome object. So now we have this, this tank gun. It's parented under the tank dome. You can see its scales changed pretty dramatically, as did its position, and that's because this is actually now a local set of coordinates and scale and so on that is with respect to or relative to the scale and position of the tank dome. So we might want to adjust that a little bit. Let's adjust that a little bit lower. There we go. There we go. So now what happens is, if we select our tank dome, it now includes that gun. And so if we start rotating, the gun comes with us, which is exactly what we want. We also can do things like rotate up and down, which is something we're definitely going to want to do with our tank. We're going to want to be able to fire the gun off at angles that are so that we can try to hit our targets. So we're going to want that. Now, of course, there's things that we don't want to allow eventually, which is like going down through the tank itself, but that's something that we can address in our program, in our scripting, so we won't allow the tank to actually turn its gun down that far. So now we have a tank with a gun. It doesn't have any treads or anything, but as I said, I'm not an artist. But this is just a little tank that's been created out of pieces that Unity gives us directly. So we haven't had to do any modeling or anything in Maya or Blender or anything like that. Now we can, and maybe somewhere down the road I might actually learn enough Blender to make a very simple tank like this, and then we can bring it into Unity as one piece with some sort of an animation rig to let us actually turn the gun and that sort of thing. But for now, this is going to do just fine for us. So we have a little tank in our world. So now I'm going to save the scene here. If I hit play, now from our game view we can see our little tank sitting there. So that's great. It doesn't do anything. We haven't told it to do anything yet, but we have our tank.